Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is one I always look forward to making every single year. That's right, we have finally reached the midpoint of 2023, so that can only mean one thing, the mid-year freakout tag. This tag is comprised of a variety of questions, allowing me to go through topics such as my favorite, least favorite, most surprising books I've read so far this year. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. So at this point in the year, I want to say I've read about 42 books, which is not too shabby. And the very first question of this video is kind of just coming out swinging, and that is, what is the best book you've read so far this year? I honestly can never really narrow down any of these questions to just one book, so I have two I'm going to talk about. The first has to be the Legends of the First Empire series by Michael J. Sullivan. I read the first 3 books to the series last year, adored them all. It made some of my favorite books of the year for 2022. This year, I'm finishing up the series. I've so far read 2 of the 3 books, and I plan on reading the third and final book very, very soon, and I have just loved every single second of reading this fantasy series, and it has catapulted itself near the top of some of my all-time favorite fantasy reads. The combination of the characters, the world, the setting, the plot, everything about it I am just wholly invested in. I love that this particular fantasy series is set in kind of an ancient setting, so a large part of the book is the discovery and the evolution of society, both for humans and other people that live around humans like elves and dwarves. But this is a story about war and a long simmering conflict between different groups of people. You follow a huge cast of characters, and every book kind of brings something new, sometimes a quest, sometimes a battle, but everything is very much interconnected. I just love Michael J. Sullivan's writing. I love his broad cast of characters. I feel like he's constantly surprising me book over book. I also love that he's also always introducing new characters I never would have anticipated reading POV chapter from, and I feel like he's always keeping me on my toes. His landscapes are lush and interesting, and the Legends of the First Empire series has been a delight for me to read. I love it. I also know I talk about it incessantly. I also want to mention Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This is a super hype book that made a lot of lists for last year when it came out in terms of being a lot of people's favorites. I finally gave into the hype and picked this book up, and I have to say I was not disappointed at all. Gabrielle Zevin's ability to write really interesting and complex characters absolutely shines within this novel, and following 2 characters in particular throughout the course of their entire friendship from childhood into their adult years, a very intimate and dynamic friendship that's fascinating and also centering around genius. And in the story, we follow our main characters Sam and Sadie, who became very close friends at a young age. They met in a hospital. Many years later, they rekindled this friendship as they meet when they're both in school at Harvard and MIT respectively. They both love video games, and they actually begin to create games together, catapulting them to fame and notoriety as the world also loves their games. This book is told in sections, kind of focusing in on different chapters of their life. You read from both of their points of view. And again, it's such a fascinating and intimate story, and I especially love the long timeline of this book. It was emotional and fascinating, and I could not put it down. Moving on to the best sequel I've read so far this year. I've honestly read a lot of really great sequels. This was hard to even narrow it down to 2. The first has to be A Desolation Called Peace by Arcadia Martin, a book I've read recently, and it's the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, which is another book I loved. This is the final book to a sci-fi duology by this author, and everything about it was honestly like perfect. This story follows our main character Mahit, and in book 1, she has just been recently promoted to become an ambassador to represent her small space station. She travels to this very large and powerful planet, which also has a lot of colonial interests, and it's up to Mahit to protect her station's interests and kind of prevent them from being taken over. When she arrives at this planet, though, a planet that she's always loved dearly from afar, fascinated by their culture, their writing, their stories, she arrives expecting to meet her predecessor, but she realizes that he has died, and she doesn't know if it's murder or not. Catapulted in the center of political conspiracy, Mahit is struggling to not only figure out what in the world is going on, but to protect herself from possibly being killed off herself. The first book takes place over just a few days, and it's a fascinating, thrilling ride full of culture and connection and longing to belong while not being accepted, and all of the politics that come with a politically leaning sci-fi tale. The sequel was even better, escalating the plot to all new heights, including outright war and conflict, also expanding the story to include other POV chapters and characters, allowing us to have a larger view of how the world itself works. And with this world being one of the most fascinating settings I've ever read, having more characters to explore it with was amazing. I love Mahit. I love all of the things the author is touching on and discussing within the story. The writing is also stunning, and I just loved A Desolation Called Peace so much. I also have to give a shout out to A Tyranny Called Faith by Richard Swan. The first book is called A Justice of Kings, and I was not expecting the directions of the sequel to go in, nor was I expecting to literally love every single second of it. I flew through this installment. Another very politically leaning story, but this time in a more traditional fantasy world. The story is set in a fantasy world that is ruled by an emperor, and the emperor has individuals called justices, which kind of go across the countryside, and they can act as a judge, jury, and executioner on behalf of the emperor's will. One of these individuals, called Justice Sir Conrad von Volt, is one of the most powerful individuals, both in magic and just his overall strength, and we follow him in book 1 as he investigates a conspiracy surrounding the aristocracy in the countryside. This conspiracy bubbles up to a much larger problem as we explore all throughout book 1, but what's fascinating about this book and series is that it's not written from Sir Conrad's point of view, but instead his apprentice's point of view, named Helena. And we see her as she kind of grapples with her training and also kind of is thrown headfirst into a really dangerous situation. We see her make friends, form connections, all of these things. It's also a group of people that you will quickly fall in love with, stuck right in the center of a large conspiracy, quickly ballooning out of control. You saw the hints of that at the end of book 1, but the second book brings us center stage to the heart of the issue as we're back in the capital city, and so much happens. Not only do we learn more about how the political apparatus itself works, but we get more insight into different political players who are vying for power themselves. We meet the emperor and all of his desires, and the book is absolutely riveting. Not to mention, the author introduces some interesting character dynamics I wasn't expecting, and I also love that this book is told retrospectively, as our main character Helena is like writing down memories and aspects of her early career and telling them to us, which I just really enjoyed. I love Tyranny of Faith, 5 out of 5 stars for sure. I cannot wait for the next book in this series. Next up is a new release that you haven't read yet, but you really, really want to, and for me that has to be The Will of Many. To be fair, this book did just come out, and it is rather long, but this book has skyrocketed at the top of my TBR, and I plan to read it super soon. This is a book set in kind of an academy setting, and a lot of people say it's just fantastic. I am a sucker for a magic school, military school, like any learning environment where our character kind of has to fit in and work their way through this sort of system. And our main character himself is one that's seeking out revenge against the empire in which he lives in. He gets admitted into one of the most prestigious military academies in the land. He's trying to play off that he is like any other pawn for the empire to use, but in reality, he's looking for ways to tear it down. And honestly, say less. I want to read it. I feel like I'm gonna love it, and I will be reading it soon. Next question is, what are some anticipated reads that you're waiting for to come out later this year? First off, I have to mention The Fragile Threads of Power by V.E. Schwab. This is the first book to the Threads of Power series, connected to the darker shade of magic world. I feel like I've been anticipating this book for so long. I also feel like I need a bit of a refresher of the world itself, but obviously this is one I'm for sure going to check out. I'm curious to see how V.E. Schwab is going to expand this world, one that I read many, many years ago and loved, but I have a feeling, or I'm hoping, I'm gonna love this one just as much. I also have to give a shout out to Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Canas. I read The Hacienda last year by this author. I listened to the audiobook, and it was the perfect combination of horror, angst, romance, and just melodrama that I loved so much. I lapped up every single second of this book, and somehow she is releasing a book that seems even more up my alley. We have another gothic horror story, but instead it is a vampire gothic horror story set in 1846 on the border between Texas and Mexico, and set during a war and conflict between the United States and Mexico. We follow our main character Nina, who was the daughter of a rancher, and many years ago she was attacked by something in the night. This attack occurred 9 years ago, and her childhood love thinks she is dead, and he's haunted by this particular instance ever since. These two characters, though, run into each other once again on the road, and they have to confront all these complicated feelings for one another, and also the dangerous creatures that still stalk the night. It just seems, again, to be another perfect combination of melodrama, romance, gothic, horror, everything I could ever want. I loved this author's debut. I will be getting this book right away. I think I'll listen to it too, just because I felt her other book was perfect for an audiobook. I could not wait. Lastly, I have Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia, another one of my all-time favorite authors. And just the tagline of this sounds like such a bizarre combination that I just know this author can pull off. It's said to be a fabulous meld of Mexican horror movies and Nazi occultism, a dark thriller about the curse that haunts a legendary lost film and awakens one woman's hidden powers. I honestly don't want to know too much about this book going into it, especially because the synopsis is so strange, but I do know it's pre-ordered and I'm gonna be reading it right away. Next up are two of my most disappointing reads so far for 2023. The first one for me has to be The Bone Shard Emperor. I have struggled with this series so much because I want to love it, but unfortunately both of these books, but especially the sequel, has just kind of delivered for me. I love the idea of this series. It has an interesting world, multi-POV, a cool magic system, turning around constructs and being able to bring things to life, but I've just always been underwhelmed by the plot development, the pacing of the plot, the expansion of the world and politics, and I'm not going to go on, but for me, this series has just kind of fallen flat. It's by no means bad, and if it does sound interesting, I still think it's worth checking out, but for me personally, it just wasn't my favorite. Also have to say, A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. This is more like, I just wish I loved Priory in this book as much as everyone else seems to love it. I read this book right when it came out, hoping that it would be the answer to all of my wishes and prayers of just loving this series. And while I do think there's a lot of good in here, there's also a lot of things that just don't perfectly add up for me. This is another instance of, this book is not bad in my opinion, it just kind of delivered in terms of my expectations. I wanted this to be a 5 out of 5 star read, but it was more like a 3.5 star read, and it's a long one. And I just felt like elements of it were great, but also elements of it were not. So I'm sad about this. Next question is a book that surprised you. And to be honest, I have read two books that are both completely unhinged that I could say wholeheartedly, oh, did they surprise me? First is Bunny by Mona Awad. This like dark academia Heathers-esque story that is absolutely an A24 movie wrapped up in a novel was an experience to say the least. We follow our main character who's part of a very prestigious writing program that's also very small. She shares all of her classes with a group of women who call themselves the Bunnies. They dress the same way, they're like wear hyper feminine clothing, and they talk in a very peculiar way too. And at the beginning of the new semester, they start inviting her to their home to study together, and everything spirals out of control from there. This book has a million genre tags because there's a million different things going on. It was shocking, it was fascinating, and it will surprise you, to say the least. I also have to give a shout out to Birnam Wood by Eleanor Canton, another very unhinged book that you'll be able to tell from just the synopsis alone. This book is set in New Zealand, and we're introduced to a large cast of characters, all a part of an organization called Birnam Wood, which is a guerrilla anti-capitalist agriculture group. They basically go around to unused land and plant vegetables and other types of things that they're able to sell back to the community. At the beginning of this book, they find a stretch of really abandoned land after like a landslide cut it off. They go there and they're kind of preparing to have their largest site yet. When the leader of Birnam Wood goes to check it out though, she comes across a very eccentric billionaire, and this interaction sets off a series of events you will simply not be able to forget. This book is a whirlwind. It definitely starts out slow. It's very philosophical, very character focused, but I assure you it really does pick up speed and becomes truly wild. It's full of a lot of like very moral people who are also terrible people, which is a very interesting combination too. Next question is a new favorite author or a new to you author, and for this I have to go with Becky Chambers. I read the Psalm of a Wild Built series this year and absolutely fell in love. I have only read like 250 pages collectively of Becky Chambers' writing, and I am delighted. I need to read all of the books she's already put out. I will also read all of the books she puts out in the future. Her ability to put so much heart in her stories, capture such beautifully rendered characters, her writing style and the worlds that she creates, just I love the books I've read of hers. I will read many, many more, at least I hope. Newest favorite characters for me, this is a bit of a tie of first Mosscap from A Psalm for the Wild Built. I love Mosscap, inquisitive robot who has such an endearing heart, and the scenarios that we find ourselves in with Mosscap are just delightful. And I also love Amina Al-Sarafi from The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by S.A. Chakraborty, a cunning and smart and hilarious female pirate who at the beginning of her story kind of brings the band back together to go out on one last adventure, and hurrah, she's notorious, she does what she wants, she's had a million husbands, and I thought she was great to anchor the story. Next up is a book that made you cry, and for this I'm going to go with The Smell of Other People's Houses. This is a short book, but one that left me sobbing. I was so emotionally invested and connected to all of the characters I read from. This book is set in the 70s in Alaska, and we follow the lives and point of views of a lot of different young people kind of on the precipice of huge change in their lives for a variety of reasons. Everyone's stories sort of become interconnected, and you follow the threads of their lives so closely and intimately. And again, I was just crying throughout this whole thing. I loved it. It was heartwarming. It shattered my world. I was rooting for everyone. I also really loved the Alaska setting too, and I feel like it added a lot of complexity to the narrative style. I adored this book. Next up, a book that made you happy outside of A Psalm for the Wild Goat, which I've already touched on. I'm also going to mention A Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Madana. This heartwarming romance found family story is everything you could possibly want in your life. But in this story, we follow our main character Mika Moon, and she is a witch. And because she is a witch, she's not supposed to hang out around other witches because their power can draw attention to humans. And because she has to keep her powers hidden, she has a hard time growing close to non-magical individuals. She does, however, create YouTube videos and post them online. And at the beginning of this book, she receives a very strange inquiry to basically become a teacher to 3 young witches at this faraway house. She's skeptical, but she decides to go and check it out. And so begins a delightful tale of romance, found family, just like second chances at life, magic. It's so heartwarming. I loved it. I listened to the audiobook and it was fantastic. If you want something that's gonna put a smile on your face, this is it. Next up, we have what are some of the most beautiful books you have bought this year? And for me, there's no competition when it comes to this. I have to give a shout out to the leather-bound Brandon Sanderson Secret Project books that I have pre-ordered for myself throughout this year. I mean, these are stunning. Not only are they, yes, leather-bound, but there's illustrations, full color end pages. I mean, the experiences of reading these books are just another level altogether. These are true collector items I will have for the rest of my life, and by far some of the just most beautiful books I've ever owned on my shelf. I hope he releases all of his books in limited edition leather bound so I can buy them and put them on my bookshelf because they're stunning. And then lastly, what are some books that you want to read or need to read before the end of this year? I have a few that I will run through. First up, I have The Fool's Quest by Robin Hobb. I'm currently reading Fool's Assassin, which is the first book to the final trilogy within the Robin Hobb universe. I've been reading it so slow because I don't want it to end, but I'm finally kind of picking up pace with the first one and I'm loving it so much that I know I'm gonna be just absolutely devouring the final books within this trilogy. It's going to break me, probably make a lot of favorites lists for me this year, but we shall see. But I definitely need to read this. From a literary fiction point of view, the book at the top of my list is There by Tommy Orange. This is a multi-POV story following lots of different perspectives and is very much like intertwining everyone's fate together. Basically, we're following a set of characters all traveling to the same place, and we kind of see how their lives are impacted by one another. I feel like I'm gonna love this book. Everyone loves this book. I want to read it before the end of the year. And then from a fantasy point of view, I really want to read Malice by John Gwen. I want to start this combat forward fantasy series. I've already read Shadow of the Gods by this author and really like it, so I have high hopes for this, and I feel like I'm going to really love it. And then I also, because I'm having a Michael J. Sullivan year, want to reread Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan. I love the Legends of the First Empire series. I'm almost done with it. I need more. And luckily, Michael J. Sullivan actually has quite a few books, so I'm going to be tearing through them all, but starting with this reread of Theft of Swords. Alrighty guys, that is the mid-year freakout tag. Please let me know down below some books you've loved so much this year, books that have disappointed you, books you're excited to read, as I would love to know, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye!